He thought no one was watching. He thought no one would ever know. But when Jason Statham walked into that old church alone, something happened that no one was prepared for. Something that broke him in a way the world had never seen. Stay with us until the end to witness what changed Jason's life forever, and why you may never look at him the same way again. There were no cameras this time, no handlers, no ticking schedule or polished interviews to fake his way through. Just Jason Statham behind the wheel of an old rental car, driving down a back road that stretched like a forgotten scar across the countryside. The asphalt cracked under the heat, bordered by dying grass and wooden fences that hadn't felt a fresh coat of paint in decades. Silence clung to the air, a rare thing in his world, and yet today it was all he wanted. He didn't know what led him here. Not really. It wasn't the kind of place you planned to return to. Just a small town buried in the middle of nowhere, where time had decided to slow down, or maybe stop altogether. But something pulled him back. A memory, maybe. A weight he didn't realize he'd been dragging for years. He eased the car to a stop just outside the main square, if you could call it that. 3 storefronts, a diner with flickering neon, and up the hill, crowned by whispering trees, a white wooden church with chipped steps and a leaning steeple. That was the moment it hit him. He had been here before, years ago, with her. He stepped out of the car slowly, as if movement might wake something buried too deep. His boots met the gravel with dull crunches, and with each step toward the hill, the air seemed to grow heavier, like the atmosphere remembered him. The church hadn't changed much. Same paint peeling under the sun, same small bell hanging lifeless above the door. But to Jason, it now felt sacred. He didn't plan to go inside. He just wanted to look, maybe stand there for a minute and leave. But his feet didn't ask for permission. They kept moving one after the other, until the door creaked open beneath his hand with the kind of softness that only old wood and older memories could make. The smell met him first, aged cedar, candle wax and dust that carried a story. The pews stretched ahead like rows of silent witnesses. No one was there, not a soul. But a faint melody drifted from somewhere behind the altar. A low, warbled hum from an old tape player still functioning against all odds. A hymn he couldn't name but somehow knew. He walked slowly down the aisle, not out of reverence, but because every step felt like trespassing on something he had forgotten. He didn't look for anyone. He didn't speak. He just moved to the very last pew and sat down, as if instinctively avoiding the front rows where faith used to feel stronger. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, hands clasped, eyes distant. He looked like a man who carried weight not on his shoulders, but inside his chest. The kind of burden that doesn't show until silence gives it space to breathe. Jason rubbed his face with both hands, then let them fall. No tears. Not yet. But something inside was stirring, the way embers wake before they burn. He had lived through bullets, betrayal, and years of pretending to be a machine. But sitting there, in that wooden silence, he realized this was the first time in a long time he hadn't been performing. No fight, no camera, just presence, just him. And then, without searching, his eyes fell on it. Between the pews, tucked into the seam of the bench like it had been waiting, an old bookmark. Frayed edges stained at the corners, faded floral print. But across the front, in delicate handwriting he could never mistake, was a message. For Jason, with eternal love. Mum. He didn't move. The air thickened. His breath caught, shallow and uneven. That bookmark. It wasn't just familiar, it was hers. From years ago, from that time. He remembered it being lost. He remembered the moment he realized it was gone, and how that simple object had wrecked him more than most funerals ever could. He had searched for it once. Then he tried to forget it. But it hadn't forgotten him. His hand trembled as he reached for it, the way someone touches the final photograph of a loved one. As his fingers closed around the fabric, the church seemed to still. The tape player clicked softly in the distance, ending the song. Nothing replaced it. Just silence. Holy, heavy silence. He turned the bookmark over. There, wedged inside the fold, was a small, worn photograph. He pulled it free with deliberate care, already sensing it would be more than just paper. It was him, maybe 9 years old, kneeling at the altar with his mother beside him, her hand on his shoulder, both looking at something unseen, something higher. But it wasn't the photo that made his stomach twist. It was the handwriting on the back, just one line, written in her script. Clear. Intentional. You promised you'd come back when you were ready. And in that instant, Jason Statham realized this was never about chance. He wasn't here by accident. He had been called. And that call had only just begun. The photo trembled slightly between his fingers, not from the air. There was no breeze inside that church, but from something deeper, something rising from within. Jason stared at the image like it was a window to a world that no longer existed. He was a boy in the picture, small, vulnerable, kneeling at the same altar now only feet away. His mother sat beside him, eyes closed, hand gently resting on his shoulder. They weren't posing, they were praying. Behind the photo, her handwriting reached across the years like a whisper trapped in ink. You promised you'd come back when you were ready. The memory hit like a forgotten blow, quiet but devastating. He remembered that day now, the light falling through the stained glass windows, dancing across the pews like little flames. His mother had insisted they go to church that morning, even though he hadn't wanted to. He had been restless, already dreaming of escape, of movement, of anything that wasn't small-town silence. She didn't lecture him. She never did. She just placed that camera in the hands of the pastor and asked for one photo, one memory. And right there, in front of the altar, she had whispered something to him. Not a demand, not a plea, a hope. Promise me you'll come back someday, when you're ready to feel again. He had nodded, more to end the moment than to commit. And then life happened. London, Hollywood, success, loss, scars too deep to share, and her gone. Jason let out a breath, uneven and heavy. His fingers pressed against his eyes, not to stop tears, but to stop time. He had spent years becoming something people admired. Strong, cold, unshakable. But none of that armor worked here. Inside this church, his body sat like a fortress. But inside that fortress, something was cracking. He stood slowly, knees tight, legs heavier than they should be, and walked toward the altar. Each step felt like a confession. He wasn't sure what he was looking for. Maybe nothing. Maybe just a place to stand and let the memory wash over him. But when he reached the altar, he saw it. A candle sat unlit beside a small wooden box. The wax was dusted, untouched, waiting. And the box, though plain, had something carved into the lid. For when the time comes. He stared at it for a long moment, afraid to move, afraid of what it might hold, but his hands moved anyway. They always did when his heart refused to. Inside, resting neatly as if it had been placed there that same morning, was an envelope. Sealed. His name written across it in that same familiar hand. No title, no flourish. Just Jason. His breath caught as he sat down on the first pew, legs folding beneath him like something old and tired. He held the envelope against his chest for a moment, feeling its weight, not physical, but emotional. Then, with fingers that betrayed no fear, but carried grief like a second skin, he opened it. The paper inside was soft, slightly yellowed, edges curled by time. Her words were inked in blue, steady, patient. She had written it slowly, with intention. Every line was deliberate. If you're reading this, it means something brought you back. Maybe it was a feeling. Maybe it was pain. Maybe, finally, it was silence. Jason read each word as if they had been waiting for his eyes. I always knew you were meant for something bigger than this place. I never tried to stop you. You were born to move mountains. But even those who climb the highest peaks need a place to come home to. He paused, the words cutting deeper than any role he'd ever played, deeper than the hardest punch he'd ever taken. If the world ever makes you forget who you are, promise me this. Come back to where you were still whole. Come back here. Come back to the boy who believed in goodness, in family, in faith. His throat tightened. He rubbed his fingers against the edge of the letter, trying to steady himself. But the words weren't done. Fame is loud, pain is louder. But the soul speaks in whispers. I hope you found your voice through the noise. And if you didn't, I hope this place helps you hear it again. He exhaled slowly, jaw clenched, chest rising and falling like waves during a storm. If my time ended before I could see you walk through these doors again, know this. I never stopped believing in you, not for 1 second. And no matter how far you ran, I was always waiting, right here. His hands gripped the letter tighter, the edges now folding beneath his fingers. A low ache spread in his chest, the kind that came from wounds never allowed to heal. There were no cameras now, no crew, no applause waiting on the other side of vulnerability, only silence, sacred, brutal, healing. He read the last line again, over and over. I never stopped believing in you. His body stayed still, but inside he was collapsing and rebuilding all at once. And then, just as his eyes began to blur, something happened. A soft, deliberate creak echoed through the church. Wood, movement. A door was opening, slowly. Jason didn't move, he wasn't alone anymore. And whoever had entered had been waiting for him too. The creaking sound lingered like a breath too afraid to exhale. Jason turned slowly, his body taut with instinct, but his soul open in a way it hadn't been in years. The light from the stained glass windows cast long patches of color across the pews, painting the silence with memory. Near the front of the church, in the first row, motionless, reverent, and somehow timeless, sat an elderly man. His posture was straight despite age, his hands folded gently on his lap, and his eyes fixed not on Jason, but on the altar. He hadn't come in with noise. He had entered like a shadow, present, quiet, necessary. Jason took a cautious step forward, then another. As he drew closer, something stirred in the back of his mind. A face, a time. Sunday mornings when faith was simpler and life smaller. That man, he had been there, sweeping the aisles, straightening the hymn books, lighting candles before anyone arrived. The old caretaker, the silent shepherd of the building's soul. The man didn't move until Jason was near enough to hear his breathing. Then, with a grace that felt almost rehearsed, he reached into the inside pocket of his coat and withdrew a small rectangular object. His hand extended slowly, holding it out as if it was something sacred. Jason looked down. It was a cassette tape, the kind the world had long since forgotten. A faded label peeled slightly at the edges, but her name was still there, written in neat, familiar handwriting. For Jason, from Mum. Jason's hand hesitated before taking it. Something about the moment made him feel like a child again, unsure, small, fragile beneath layers he'd spent a lifetime building. The man gave no instruction, no explanation. He simply offered the tape with a look that said, "It's time." Jason turned and walked to the back of the church, where old equipment sat beneath a dusty cloth. A tape player, ancient but intact, rested on a wooden shelf, just waiting. His fingers fumbled slightly as he placed the cassette in its slot, pushed it down with a soft click, and pressed play. For a moment, only the gentle hiss of the tape rolling could be heard. Then her voice came through, soft, unsure at first, then steadier, the way someone speaks when they think no one's listening. It wasn't a message, it was a recording. She had captured a moment. Jason's breath caught as he recognized the sound of his own younger voice. Small, honest, unfiltered. A boy's voice in the middle of prayer. "Dear God, please help my mum never be sad again. And please, make me strong like the men in the movies. But also, make me the kind of man who can cry and still be good." Jason closed his eyes. The recording continued, but he couldn't hear the rest. His mind had drifted far. His mother had recorded him, not as a keepsake, but as a memory she knew he'd one day need to hear. Not to remember her, but to remember himself. The sound of his own childhood voice praying for her happiness shattered whatever was left of the wall inside him. And for the first time in what felt like forever, the tears came. Not as a trickle, not as a silent trace. They broke through like rain after drought, cleansing, full, and unstoppable. His hands covered his face, not to hide, but to hold something sacred. He cried without shame, without restraint. He cried like a son who had found a piece of his mother long after she was gone and realized he was still her little boy underneath it all. The old man stood quietly, letting the tape finish its gentle loop. Then, slowly, he walked forward, his steps steady despite the weight of time. When he reached Jason's side, he didn't speak right away. He simply placed one hand on his shoulder, firm, grounding, full of knowing. Jason didn't flinch. It wasn't the touch of a stranger. It was something older, something father-like. Not in blood, but in spirit. A reminder that not every man who enters your story needs to speak in order to heal a part of it. And finally, with the voice of someone who had waited too long to speak, the old man said only what needed saying. "She knew you'd come back." Jason lowered his hands and exhaled, the kind of breath that doesn't just leave the lungs, it leaves the soul. The old man stepped back and reached once more into his coat. Another envelope. This one was heavier, thicker, sealed with wax. On the front, just a single line. "For Jason, when he's ready to hear the truth." The old man handed it over, then returned to his seat in the first row. He said nothing more. He didn't need to. Jason sat in silence, the envelope in his lap, his heartbeat loud in his ears. Because the truth inside wasn't just from his mother. It was from someone he thought he'd lost forever. Jason sat alone at the altar, the envelope resting between his palms like something too sacred to open quickly. The wax seal had cracked slightly with time, but it still held. His breath was slow, controlled, yet beneath that stillness, an undercurrent of dread moved through him. He peeled back the seal and unfolded the letter with care, expecting more of her words, another piece of her soul to cling to. But this was different. The handwriting was rougher, less elegant. Letters pressed too hard into the paper, lines slightly shaky but determined. It wasn't hers. It was his father's. The name wasn't written. It didn't need to be. The voice of the letter came through loud and clear. That absence that had haunted Jason his entire life now had weight, ink, paper, regret. "If you're reading this, it means you came back. I never knew if you would. I hoped, I prayed, but I didn't deserve it. Not after what I did." Jason's fingers curled around the edges of the letter. His eyes, sharp and weathered from a life in the spotlight, softened with every line. "I ran. That's the truth. I didn't know how to stay. Didn't know how to be a man. Your mother was stronger than I ever was. And I left you to learn the hard things without a father to show you how. The words weren't poetic. They weren't wise. But they were real. Raw. They bled honesty. I watched your life unfold from the shadows. Saw you in newspapers, on TV, on movie screens. You became everything I wasn't. But when I saw your eyes, no matter how famous you became, I recognized the sadness. It looked just like mine. Jason's chest tightened. I kept hoping someone else would show up for you, that someone better than me would step in. But no one ever did, and I couldn't forgive myself for not being brave enough to come back. So I left this letter here, in the one place I thought you might someday return to, if God had mercy. Each word pulled something buried to the surface, years of quiet longing, hidden questions, anger with no direction. All of it now being met by a voice from the past he thought he'd buried. You never needed to be strong all the time. You only were because I wasn't. I should have been the wall for you to lean on. Instead, I became the shadow you carried. Jason lowered the letter into his lap and leaned forward, his elbows pressing into his thighs, his head bowed. The weight of everything he'd survived, the fame, the grief, the silence, settled into something new: forgiveness. He stood slowly, almost reverently, and walked toward the front of the church. There, still waiting where he'd found it hours before, sat the unlit candle. He reached into his pocket and found a matchbook. The flame came quickly, and as it touched the wick, the candle caught, flickering softly. A glow filled the space, quiet and golden, and Jason knelt before it, not as a celebrity, not as a symbol, but as a son. His eyes closed, and without words he prayed, not for answers, not for strength, but for peace. A silence filled the church that was no longer hollow. It was full of memory, of grace, of every scar that now felt softer in the light. When he finally stepped outside, the sunlight had shifted. Afternoon had begun to fall, casting longer shadows across the gravel path. A group of children played in the distance, running through the yard beside the church, laughing, chasing the wind. One of them, no more than 10, paused when he saw Jason. The boy pointed curiously, then asked with a smile Jason hadn't seen in years, "Aren't you that guy from the movies?" Jason smiled gently, something quiet in his expression. "Not today," he said without saying it. "Today, I'm just my mother's son." He walked back to the church door, holding the photo in one hand and the letter in the other. He approached the old caretaker, who stood watching from the steps, hands folded. Jason didn't speak. He simply handed over both items, the photograph and the letter, and nodded once, asking silently that they be kept there forever. Not as relics, but as testimony. As he turned to leave, he paused by the car, looking once more toward the church, toward the candle still burning, toward everything he thought he'd lost, and now, somehow, found again. He lifted his head to the sky, not in search of something, but in gratitude. His face, once carved in stone, now wore the softest trace of a smile. And then, from behind him, inside the church, a sound broke the stillness. The tape recorder. It had turned on by itself. The wheels turned. The hiss of old tape filled the air. Then her voice returned. "If you're hearing this, my son, then you came back. And now, I can finally be at peace." And in that moment, for the first time in his life, so could he. Some stories aren't made for headlines. They're made for the heart. And this one, it found its way back to his. If this moment moved you, if you felt something stir inside, don't let it stop here. Subscribe to the channel for more stories that remind us what truly matters. And remember, the strongest men aren't those who hide their pain, but those brave enough to return to where it began.